Broadcasting live from the Permian Radioactive Exclusion Zone in West Texas. It's Radio Free Sirajavoy. I'm Bhangbhangduc, and this is Aelita, or Bra Impact. And
it's pronounced Aelita.
Aelita, all right. And we've got an interesting episode today. I hope you have your Geiger counters ready, because we're going to be talking about a small problem with the fracking industry.
Small.
Involving, yes.
Just a tiny.
And we're also going to be covering in brief the developments in the economy that have taken place since I think it was November when we did the episode where we talked about what was going on in the economy.
I believe so, if not late October.
So you want to start us off with this Rolling Stone article?
Oh yeah, that when I read that one, my just sheer disdain at the bureaucratic engineering nightmares that we have contrived through the fossil fuel industry. I didn't think it could go any lower, but it turns out apparently it can. So it was revealed after a several month-long investigation that was broken by Rolling Stone of all magazines.
By the way, this article is America's Radioactive Secret by Jason Maxey and Rolling Stone.
Justin Noble.
Oh, Justin Noble?
Yes.
Okay,
so
yeah, I had
essentially,
the wrong name somewhere.
Here's how hydraulic fracturing or fracking works. You pump water into hydrocarbon reservoirs, whether they're oil or natural gas. You do that to disrupt them, and you force the valuable hydrocarbons to the surface. As a result, you get this huge amount. Many trillions of gallons are produced every year of this brine from salts that leach into it that's got all sorts of wonderful chemicals in it. And there's effectively no way to utilize it other than to just dump it. Most of it gets just poured back into the earth.
Usually as hydraulic fracking fluid.
Yep. But because there's so much of it, it's been being farmed out for all sorts of different industrial uses.
It's hard to find industrial uses for it because it's not like uniform mixture, is my understanding. It's just whatever was in the rocks of the place.
Yep. So it's basically just salty water with a whole bunch of chemical intrusions. Mm-hmm. And it also happens to be radioactive.
Yeah, because there's radium and uranium. I think it's mostly radium and uranium that's underground.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not... radium and uranium are present in trace amounts, all over. I guess uranium is probably worse for you because it decays into lead, but it's not a huge issue for most purposes just because it's pretty dilute. But when you're pushing, millions of gallons of water through material and then sucking it all up, those trace amounts of radium become pretty significant.
Yep. And because a lot of the same geologic processes that produce things like natural gas and oil also help concentrate certain ores, you tend to find uranium deposits co-located with major natural gas and oil reserves.
Yeah, let me quote from the Rolling Stone here. Radium, typically the most abundant radionuclide in brine, that's fracking brine, is often measured in picocuries per liter of substance, and is so dangerous it's subject to tight restrictions even at hazardous waste sites. The most common isotopes are radium-226 and radium-228. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission requires industrial discharges, as she said, to remain below 60 for each. 4 of Peter's samples — Peter is a truck driver who took samples of the fracking fluid that he was transporting — registered combined radium levels above 3,500, and 1 was more than 8,500. So we're looking at about, what is that? 10 to a... No, that's about...
That's 100 times.
That's about 100 times the recommended safe
limit to this.
Safe limit to this. Well, the safe limit to this for hazardous waste.
Yep. This brine is being spread on roads for de-icing and for this absurd thing that rural governments do where they spray it on rural dirt roads to try to cut down on the dust, in spite of the fact that there seems to be no evidence that it helps at all on the dust levels. So
this stuff is they're trying to get rid of it. They have so much. They do so much fracking. They create so much brine that finding some kind of use for this substance is really difficult, especially because when you're fracking, one of the things that you want to get out of, one of the best ways to you do hydraulic fracking is actually with pure. They make I think I read this somewhere that they make like a pure hydrocarbon mixture for injection, and they use this to get, they pull carbon dioxide out of the air, turn it into a carbon fluid, and they use that for hydraulic fracking because it's I think it has a very high mass, so when you're trying to get lots of pressure, it works. You can get higher pressure with less the stuff or something. I'm not a underground chemical. I don't have the 5 PhDs you need to understand fracking, but the upshot is that fracking brine is not the ideal fracking fluid.
It is a waste product.
Yes, and so to get one of the big issues with a waste product is how do you get rid of it? You have massive amounts of it, and you have to either build giant tanks or you have to find a way to treat it so that it's safe to put it in water. And fracking companies have gotten around this, this expensive, in detailed, politically radioactive issue of how to treat toxic waste by lobbying to make sure that no studies are ever done of fracking brine, so that no one ever knows what's actually in it. And because no one can know what's in it, it's considered safe to dump in streams, on roads, in farmland, to give to animals, etc. And
essentially it's a completely unregulated toxic waste.
Yes.
And it's being dumped by the millions of gallons into the ecosystem.
Yeah. And it's more than just toxic, it's highly radioactive. It can be highly radioactive, and no one knows. There's been no effort at tracking it. They've been doing this fracking has been done since the 1980s, but it only really kicked off in the Obama administration. Thanks, Obama. And so for the past about decade and a half, I'd say, they've just been producing, trillions of gallons of this and basically dumping it around. So the question for America now is what does this mean? This is something that I've been struggling with this story, is the question of where do we go from this? Like, how much land needs to be transformed into like a Chernobyl style exclusion zone? Because that is what we're talking about. Well, substantially worse than Chernobyl, right? Because Chernobyl is one source of radioactive radiation.
And it's localized. This is spread everywhere in places we don't even know. Like, no one keeps track of where the brine is dumped.
Because it's brine. It's...
Yeah. So, we're talking about... there's one quote in the article, like, the oil sites themselves were already radiological catastrophes. This had been known since the 1990s. So it's not as though this was something that couldn't be predicted. Everyone in the industry already knew that anything to do with the oil and natural gas industries was a radiological hazard, and you had to protect workers to do that in order to comply with regulations. So they managed to skirt around this very, very effectively.
And part of it is that you just don't intuitively think radiation when you think of oil and gas.
Well, yeah, because nuclear power is this giant black box that almost no one understands. All they know is that it's dangerous. Whereas, we handle gasoline almost on a daily basis in the United States. Most people own cars. Most people handle gasoline. Yeah.
And people understand mines. And their mines aren't dangerously radioactive unless they're specifically mining like uranium or something. So people have... You don't really... People in think to test it. And that leads to all kinds of...
situation that we're in right now.
Yeah. I live in California where we don't have fracking yet. So I think I'm probably fairly safe.
I live in Montana. In my part of the state, there is quite a bit less of that due to the geology here. It's more mountainous out in the west. But in eastern Montana and North Dakota, there is a lot of oil and natural gas exploration, and that includes hydraulic fracturing, which I just want to really underscore and emphasize this in triple. As we discussed in our second episode, hydraulic fracking has never made money for oil. It has been marginally useful for natural gas, but the huge cost in labor and capital has made it basically a financial boondoggle.
And adding the costs of safe handling of radioactive substances to this, what's already a money pit, would kill it.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what has already happened to America, I expect, a sane government would have to shut down fairly large portions, especially in Pennsylvania and West Texas. A lot of places are just gonna maybe absolutely the Trump administration is never gonna relocate relocate millions of people out of radiation zones. They're gonna have to relocate whole cities.
Yeah, and some of the anecdotes that are conveyed in the article are just horrifying. People are talking about having instant health reactions within days of brine being spread on roads near their house.
There's a story here about Amish children walking down the street with bare feet, splashing through radioactive water that had been spread on the dirt road for de-dusting. It's nightmarish.
Yep.
And so what the oil and gas company says is that it's not very much radiation. They say it's like eating a banana a week. The reality is that there are multiple kinds of radiation, and that it's a very different, just because it's not a huge quantity of, right?
Yeah.
You get a large quantity every time you turn on your
You're breaking up.
light.
Yeah. Sorry, you're kind of going robot.
All right. You get a lot of radiation when you turn on your light or you walk outside, but that doesn't necessarily melt your insides because it's infrared. It's on a different frequency.
Yep. Yeah, that's the photons, light. The kind of radiation that they're talking about in this is caused by the decay of radionuclides. And radium, the number one source of these problems, is an alpha decay, which is one of the more dangerous kinds because it causes a whole lot of cellular damage because you ingest it into your body. And when it's outside your body, your skin can protect you, but inside your body, there's almost no defense against it. So you have any of this dissolved into your bloodstream, it often gets deposited in your bones because of its chemical properties, and it just starts spewing alpha particles throughout the interior of your body, causing cellular damage.
And it's obviously a catastrophe. I think, what can you do to protect yourself and your family right now? I think that's a useful thing to discuss. There are people who study radiation, navigating high radiation areas. Really, it could be anywhere, especially if you live around fracking sites, or if you see, people, if they use fracking brine if they regularly spraying de-icing agents on roads during winter, or anti-dust agents on dirt roads during summer. That could very well be a radioactive solution. You may want to buy a Geiger counter, especially if you live in Pennsylvania, Appalachia, or South Dakota or West Texas. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, a lot of people don't have especially in those areas, which are in general economically underprivileged.
Yeah. It's a problem that's being spread around largely, in rural areas, which are already in a deep economic depression due to the poor state of farm incomes, which have not gotten any better in the past few years. They've only been getting worse, particularly in the result of this wonderful little trade war. Even with billions of dollars being spent in subsidies every year, farm incomes on average are negative.
Yeah.
So people in rural areas are going deeper in debt, and lots of people, particularly the ones who are poorest off, are living in areas where the local governments, faced with a pinch, think that they can get this beneficial stuff for a song because it's essentially waste, and they're poisoning their communities.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's likely to be no. I think most American politicians at this point very fully support fracking.
Mm-hmm.
There are some tentative moves against it. Bernie Sanders opposes it, but I think Warren. Does Warren support it? I think Warren is like.
I think her response on it is the same as her response on everything, is that she's going to form a committee.
Big structural reform to the fracking and oil and gas industry. Let's not become Chapo Trap House. Let's not talk about a lot of American electoral stuff. But I think it's worth pointing out that
this is deeply embedded in the institutions of the American state.
Yeah, because it's so tied up with oil security and oil independence.
Yeah, this quixotic notion that American politicians can't help but chase after the idea of economic independence, as though we don't exist in a global market.
Yeah. I think we might have talked about this, that it was the last time that the average American consumer really felt, or not the average American, the middle class, white, suburban American ever felt some kind of like serious lack of resources. In the 70s, they had to ration oil. People had lines and pumps. The way people talk about it, you would have think it was like the end of the world.
Yep.
And it was evidence then that the idea that, in the Soviet Union, they have all these shortages. This is my reading of it. They had, people will always say in the Soviet Union, they had shortages of this, shortages of that. You had to ration this, that, and the other thing. And we don't have to do that in America. And it's a huge piece of national pride, even though it's not true.
Yep.
That when that facade was broken by the oil crisis, the American government went into overdrive to prevent that from ever happening again. And that culminated with fracking. And hopefully fracking is the poison pill that destroys the oil industry. But it's already the poison pill for millions and millions of Americans.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Chasing this pitiful dream of energy independence as though it actually means anything for the average person.
Yeah.
But it certainly sounds wonderful.
Yeah. And I remember they tied it in with like environmentalism somehow. It was always part of environmental policy back in the 2000s. It was like Obama had something called like the all of the above energy plan. They were trying to do oil, coal, clean coal.
Yep. Natural gas, wind, solar, ethanol, basically the scattershot approach. Throw money at as many special interests as possible.
Yeah. And now, of course, renewable power is really crushing everything.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So yeah, the big question is, like, obviously this is something that will take decades to spool down. Like, there's still this brine going to be spread everywhere, going to be dumped in streams, going to be contaminating water tables just through the process of fracking itself. You can't contain any of the fracking liquid within the reservoirs run. It's going to always end up escaping. There's always going to be contamination of local soil, water tables. Yeah. And we're spreading a huge chemical and radiological problem throughout these ecosystems.
Yeah. Although I think radiation is usually not as bad for ecosystems on the whole.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the plant and animal life will die faster, but it, like, especially because it means that there's large areas that humans can't cultivate. Usually the effect is pretty...
Yeah. It will have a huge amount of effect upon people in these areas.
Yeah. Again, this is like Chernobyl if they'd lied about Chernobyl for a decade and it was in every city in the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
This is... I mean, they're going to have to redraw the map of the United States. You're not going to be able to go hiking in many places without a Geiger counter and a mask.
Yeah. Because, nothing is being done to stop this. It just keeps continuing. And, We're going to have to start seeing huge questions about what do we do with public and private land that's been contaminated.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Americans are uniquely ill-equipped to deal with this question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, some of our viewers might be still too young to remember, but remember when a group of yahoos took over a wildlife reserve in Oregon.
That was like 2 years ago, though.
And it was more than 2 years ago.
Oh my god, I feel
it was like 2013.
Was that the Malheur
Yep.
Wildlife Preserve?
Mm-hmm.
Was that was
Bundy
that
clan.
Ammon Bundy? Yeah.
Yep.
Holy shit, that was 2013?
No, sorry, it was
No way.
2016.
Okay, phew.
Yeah, 2013 was their standoff with the BLM, not the good one, the Bureau of Land Management, over the fact that they had not paid the federal government like over $1 million in grazing fees for public land over the period of 30 years.
Okay, so for non-American listeners and for people who may not be aware of this, the U.S. land ownership is very different depending on what side of the Mississippi River you're on. In the East, it's almost entirely privately owned. And in the West, there are huge swaths of land that are publicly owned. In my experience, it's mostly because they are completely uninhabitable desert or other... Yeah,
they're too far away from like major centers of population and resources to be valuable. So the federal government still owns them because they were in the liberal legal framework the initial owner. All land west of the Mississippi was once owned by the federal government, and then they opened this up to homesteaders.
But no one wants to homestead in the middle of the Arizona desert.
Yep.
Because place is like it's like another planet.
Mm-hmm. So these Nevada ranchers graze their livestock on public lands, and they have to pay certain fees for access to public land, basically to prevent the tragedy of the commons.
Yes.
They don't want to have overgrazing.
Which isn't a real thing. So
yeah, it's more the tragedy of people deriving private benefit from public goods.
Yeah.
That if they can do that unrestrained, they will inevitably deplete it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to have some sort of regulatory mechanism to control access.
Yeah.
And these people were very shamelessly just not paying. And when the Bureau of Land Management tried to enforce it, they had an armed standoff.
Yeah. And
managed to get away with it.
Yeah.
Because they were the cause celeb for every reactionary in the United States.
Mm-hmm. It's the idea of public ownership is so, or like having to pay, or I don't know. We don't like having to pay for anything either. But like the idea of belonging to a society is so horrific to the right that, you know, they believe they should just be able to do whatever they want.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so to bring it back to the radiation, the response to this is going to be very different depending on where in the world it's actually happening, where in America it's happening. It's in the East. I think it's simpler in the West because simply...
Yeah, so much more of the land is federal land that has been opened up to fracking.
Yeah, so they can simply restore the land. They can simply restore the land to public ownership, and no one is going to go out there because it's 400 miles from the nearest town.
Mm-hmm.
That isn't a fracking puppet. But in the East, where as I understand it, it's been a lot more because in the West there's a lot more space, more uninhabited space for it to be done in, not safely, but further away. Yeah,
and fewer people in every square mile. But yeah, back east where it's much more densely populated, there's a huge patchwork of different private interests that are going to be involved in this because any ecological issue doesn't care where your property line is.
Yeah.
It follows natural laws like gravity and the flow of water.
Mm. So, I mean, like thinking about the scale of this is really mind-blowing, mostly because we don't really know how big it is. But I'm looking at like southern Ohio, probably the west side of West Virginia. Pennsylvania. These are densely populated areas. They're kind of backcountry by the standards of the East, but they're still, for those of us in the West, they're pretty densely populated and close to everything.
Yeah, and unlike Chernobyl, where most of the problem are short-lived fission products that can decay sometimes even in a human lifetime, we're talking about something that has a half-life of 1,600 years.
Yeah, Chernobyl is mostly safe these days.
Yeah, any contamination done by this process is effectively permanent. Within, this, we're talking about something that will last 5 times longer than the length of the history of the United States. And
I mean, it's in cities. Like, it's not out, as I understand it, Chernobyl was a fairly large city, but it was not like, it was out in the marshes. It's not like it happened in Kiev or Leningrad or Moscow.
Yeah, we have fracking sites outside of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, through the massively populated state of Texas, at the headwaters of the Missouri River in North Dakota.
Yeah, so like this is what we're talking about in terms of places that may just have to be relocated. I don't know if Pittsburgh or Philadelphia are irradiated right now, but they could be.
Yeah, they'll have to do to find out the scale of the problem alone will be a huge effort. You'll have to do radiological surveys of just about everywhere that could potentially be contaminated.
And it's made harder by the fact that there's no records of where the stuff is going.
It's completely unregulated, almost entirely, beyond the minimal, like, Department of Transportation regulations.
And it's even exempt from a lot of Department of Transportation regulations. Like, they don't have to mark it as potentially radioactive.
Yep. Most of the time, most of the people who are doing this are usually much smaller business. They're not the oil companies and gas companies themselves. They're just small outfits who purchase this brine cheap and use it for whatever they can.
Yeah, they're mom and pop radiation spreaders. Small business people, the lifeblood of the heartland.
Yeah.
So yes, if you live in an area that could potentially be impacted by this, congratulations, you are now the star of the new Fallout game, and there's no good way to put. There's no like smiley face you can put on this. I guess it sucks. There goes large portions of America destroyed in the past. This is like we don't know the full extent of it, so let's not. I don't want to overly catastrophize, but it's hard not to because it is a catastrophe.
Yep.
So that's your situation. Maybe consider buying a Geiger counter. I'm serious about that. You're gonna want to, you're just gonna want to make sure you're not stumbling into a radioactive pit if you go hiking or whatever. Don't play in.
Yeah, don't play in the fracking brine.
Yeah. But I guess, I mean, I don't know if there's any American, like, I haven't seen anyone talking about this. I'd assumed it would become an issue when this came out. This came out on the 20th. So I assumed that in the past 10 days, someone would have said something. It would have become an issue for some political campaign, but I guess everyone's keeping quiet.
Yeah, well, we live in the information overload. It's like this is one disaster among countless many of those competing for people's attention. And because there's so little data to really know about this, how exactly large the scale is, it could be, the worst thing to have ever befall this country, or it could be, merely almost as bad as climate change.
Yeah.
The not knowing allows people to just tune it out and focus on things that they can affect.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, we already have a housing crisis. It's not going to be. This is the kind of thing that crashes economies. This is the Dust Bowl on steroids. I'm just thinking about the ramifications of having to evacuate even one of these major cities in this area, even a small city. Like Huntington, West Virginia. right?
Look at the ongoing consequences we're still having from the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans.
Yeah.
Which that was almost a decade and a half ago now.
Mm-hmm.
The diaspora of people from Louisiana.
Yeah. It's going to reshape the entire United States. That's the reality of it is that there's no way that this ends with the United States looking the way it has for the past 200 years.
Ironically, right now trending on Twitter is the hashtag RIP America. And this is entirely about the impeachment trial. When an actual existential problem continues to go on, like this expose hasn't done anything about the fracking industry. They're not trying to hastily shut it down.
Yeah. I mean, at a minimum, the response that would be necessary for this is, I guess you would have to just fold an entire branch of the military into the Department of Energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go to every ban. You'd have to put a freeze on fracking, and then have radioactivity. You'd have to somehow mobilize maybe 1 million people just to be radioactive, first responders, and you would have to examine every city in America, every drinking water, every creek, every stream, every dirt road.
And state governments would have to take despotic measures against private property.
Yeah, I mean, they'd have to kick millions of people off their property, or not. They would have to. They do have to. And no, I can't see any government doing that.
You went robot again.
I can't see them doing it.
Yeah, it's very clearly so against everything in American political culture that nothing could be done about this. And this is just a taste of the kinds of problems that would have to be faced in any of the more realistic climate change scenarios in the next century. Yeah.
Although, I mean, I think I tend to be more of an optimist on this, because I think, a lot of the more dramatic things require fossil fuels to be used past the 2030s, and I can't see strong growth in fossil fuels past I guess this year, really. There's just too much competition, and they're just too exposed to too much risk. Even if climate change, let me put it this way, even if there was no climate change, even if there was no pressure to divest, the industry is no longer a productive sector of the economy. Yep.
And speaking of productive sectors of the economy, there may not be very many left right now.
Yeah. So to turn a little bit from one catastrophe to another, let's talk about the economy. The yield curve inverted again, and okay. So I think it was November we talked about the problems facing the U.S. economy and predicted an economic crash fairly proximately.
Mm-hmm.
And we're kind of going to do that again, but I want to say something, which is that Marxists get talked about a lot. The old joke goes that Marxists have predicted 30 of the past two recessions. And I want to talk about that before we continue to predict doom and gloom. I think it would be useful to talk about some of the reasons for that. And I think the biggest one is that the Marxist economic position is fundamentally pessimistic. So the prediction doesn't so much say, it's not they're definitely catastrophic sort of casual Marxists a lot. But the underlying issue is that the theory goes that capitalism itself has fundamental problems. So the economy tends towards crash at all times.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So
every boom is followed by a bust.
Yeah.
Ours has been going on an unusually long amount of time.
Yeah. What's that story goes? The remember this too shall pass.
Yeah. The old adage.
Yeah.
So
King Solomon? No.
I think it's often attributed to Confucius.
Okay.
Anyway, not long after we did our episode about the state of the macroeconomy, the Federal Reserve started engaging in some largely unprecedented repurchase agreement operations to do major liquidity injections into the financial sector.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, they're buying back assets, trying to inject cash into the financial system to keep them liquid so they can continue their normal loaning operations to keep business going as usual.
They also lowered the interest rates by, I think, 100 basis points over two ratchetings.
Yep. So basically, making credit cheaper for core banks so that the money supply can expand and continue driving economic activity.
Yeah. A brief word about other places in the world, because I've recently been informed that those exist. The Eurozone is stagnant or in recession, with a gigantic flyball coming right at their head in the form of Brexit. China is typically silent on what the economy is shaped like, or typically not silent, but typically cagey. But they've been closing a lot of rural banks, and the coronavirus is definitely going to be a strain on their economy. But I don't know. I just don't believe in big economic shocks like that. I don't believe that like the coronavirus is going to cause a depression. I just don't think that that's how that works.
Yeah, it's verging into literal animal spirits rather than metaphorical animal spirits.
Mm-hmm. I guess Japan is Japan.
The industrial production indexes in China have been definitely slowing down.
Mm-hmm. The thing about China is they really have had so much. They had really had so much space to grow that they went from essentially an agrarian economy in 1990 to a developed industrial economy 30 years later. So there was so much space to expand that they could push through the tendency towards crisis with a combination of state spending and geographical expansion. But the geographical expansion is really coming to an end nowadays.
It's like, so much of China's energies have gone from merely promoting exports to trying to expand investment into other markets.
Mm-hmm.
The whole One Belt, One Road initiative, the massive investments into Africa and Southeast Asia to try to find new places for Chinese capital to go for profitable ventures.
Yeah. But bringing it back to the most important country in the world, America.
Fuck yeah.
I think every communist is allowed a little bit of regional chauvinism.
A little chauvinism as a treat.
The Fed has been going into this is what the things they're doing are the kinds of things you do during a recession. They're the kinds that they're doing recovery efforts before the crash has happened. And in one sense, this really shows. I mean that's impressive, right? I think I have to hand it to them that they are carrying out, like, they're doing what they planned to do after 2008. They decided, the Fed needs to be more proactive. They need to be able to predict recessions and respond to them before they happen. The problem is they're just completely fundamentally wrong on how economies work. And so they are, instead of heading off a recession, they are a little.
They're basically expending the resources that they would use to fight a depression now. Your internet is definitely anti-communist.
It is absolutely anti-communist. It's terrible.
Yeah, continuing to prove my point. I got like maybe every other word from that last sentence.
All right, well, you want to... There we go. Just the whole... Yeah, sorry about that, guys. I should try to find a better place to record. Anyway, we've been moving into overdrive, doing damage control before the damage is struck. They're being preventative.
What's interesting is like so much of bourgeois macroeconomics for decades before this cautioned against this, of the misguided but somewhat correct belief that by doing this you would overheat the economy. Like you run the engine too hard, you put more stress on it, and so when it does finally give out, you are in a worse position than if you just pulled over to the side of the road now.
Yeah. You can tell the sophistication of bourgeois economics by the sophistication of their metaphors.
Yes.
The economy is like a car.
Don't pump the gas too much.
Yes. I'm not sure if it's more sophisticated than that at all.
Yeah, a lot goes into trying to come up with wonderful theoretic models about how people trade commodities back and forth in a vacuum without ever bothering to figure how commodities are produced.
Mm-hmm. Or asking the question of whether or not we live on a desert island.
Yep. Good old Robinson Crusoe.
Yeah.
So, the stock market's major rallies have all been in the news a lot recently. And what do you know? Each one of these major stock rallies has followed right after these overnight liquidity injections by the Federal Reserve.
Thanks, Sven Henrik at Northman Trader, by the way.
Yes.
I'm not sure if that guy knows about his new following of young communists. But
yeah, we are definitely fans. He's been doing great work.
Yeah. And the tendency here is pretty intuitive, I would say. I mean, a lot of economics is pretty intuitive. The bigger the rise before a crash, the bigger the crash. It's the opposite of what you would think in medicine, where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Because the best time, even from the perspective of the bourgeois economics, the best time to intervene is a crash, because that's when there's a minimal amount of activity going on. So small interventions can have large effects.
Yeah. So right now we're having an immense overvaluation of huge portions of the United States economy due to speculative activity.
Well, I don't even know if it's. I mean, I think last year there was a lot of speculative activity, but after the injections, so liquidity is a measurement of how much stocks are being purchased. It's not normally when people talk about liquidity, it means like how liquid you are, how solvent you are.
Yeah, how
easy it is to turn your money into money. Yeah, it's a little different here. It's how much. It has to do with how many stocks are being purchased per day, and they want to have a lot of stocks purchased per day because that's the circulation of capital, I guess. They think I don't know. I don't know all of the specifics of this, but it's how it keeps demand up. It keeps the valuations of stocks up. It keeps capital theoretically flowing into productive sectors of the economy, where it can be turned into fixed and variable capital. You can go from money capital to fixed or variable capital. Yeah.
And the last thing that you want in this process is these very, very cagey animal spirits driving the investors to get spooked and diminish their confidence so that they keep their money where it's at, rather than trying to find a better deal for their money.
Whereas what's happening behind the scenes is the money is going nowhere. It's going into non-productive, borderline. It's going into criminal conspiracies. It's going really. That's what it's going into. It's going into people getting around environmental protections, getting around labor laws, and trying to make more efficient products that are worse and stupider and are hideously overvalued. The one analogy is the YouTube or the Facebook videos. Remember when Facebook had they did that video thing? They told everyone that to come to Facebook video, and they faked numbers of people watching videos on Facebook, and so a bunch of content creators moved to Facebook video, chasing the advertisement, chasing the viewer base, and then Facebook revealed they'd been lying. No one was ever watching those videos.
And they lost everything.
Yeah, it's like that, but with everything.
Yep. So people are basically. Investors are taking the money that they are getting, selling these securities back to the Federal Reserve, and they're putting it into stocks. That's why the stock market goes up every time one of these is going in. They're moving into these assets that seem to continue to appreciate, and they're just driving the bubble bigger and bigger.
Interestingly, here we have very clear evidence of the Marxist theory of value, or the Marxist law of value. Because what we see very clearly happening is that these stocks are commodities that have real value in terms of the fixed and variable capital that they represent and the productive capacity they represent. But they also have value that's determined by supply and demand. And in this case, the Federal Reserve's actions are increasing demand, resulting in, by increasing liquidity, increasing the number of purchases that take place. In order that, you have to increase demand. And the way they increase demand is by giving stock traders and hedge funds more purchasing power. So to put that in plain English, the Federal Reserve is giving billions of dollars of tax money to people with billions of dollars already.
Stonks.
What happens is the value of the asset, the stock, is driven up by high demand when that high value does not represent its actual value.
Yep. When individual people act in conspiracy to do this to, say, a junk bond or a penny stock, it's called pump and dump, and it's illegal. When the Federal Reserve does it to the entire macroeconomy, that's apparently just good business.
Yeah. Which, I don't know. I don't know what to... I've kind of given up on predicting when it's going to happen or like where it's going to start.
I think very clearly the people who are at the levers do seem to understand that there is a problem coming, and they're doing everything available to them to try to forestall that problem.
Yeah, they're doing everything within the bounds of their ideological framework.
Yeah.
They're trying to...
In some conspiratorial sense, you might think that, well, they're trying to just keep the lights on and keep the engine moving until after the 2016 election, 2020 election. It could very well be that base of a motive.
But I think at the same time, they also do just generally have a mandate to keep the engine running at all times.
Yes.
So it's hard to say if they're trying to support Donald Trump or... Although, what's the difference?
Yep. I do think, with the flurry of articles that we get, every time Bernie's poll creeps up by half a percentage point, some people are very, very scared at the very thought that there could be a little bit more activist government in the United States.
And this is where it's important to point out that something like Medicare for All or like Bernie's headline plan policies, Sanders' headline policies, Medicare for All and student debt. They don't say it. They don't say it right out, but they mean the destruction of massive amounts of financial assets. These are overvalued assets anyway. Yeah,
these are parasitic assets too that depend upon basically rentier relationships to huge portions of the American people.
Yeah.
So, in an objective sense, plowing them under could never be anything but a good thing for the majority of people.
Even from the perspective of bourgeois economics.
Yep. But to the people who are most heavily invested, even people who are not directly invested in these industries still are tied to their value.
Yeah.
The last thing you want to do is see trillions of dollars in assets just be sunk practically overnight.
Absolutely. I mean, my creeping theory, this is my creeping conspiracy theory, is that pharmaceutical companies and I don't know if it's really a conspiracy theory, but pharmaceutical companies and student loan or universities are functioning more and more like shadow banks. That it's an entire $1 trillion sector. That because when you create debt, you create an asset. So by putting people in medical debt or by putting people in what's the other one? Education debt.
Yeah.
The student loan debt. You create an asset with a certain amount of value, even if that value isn't necessarily its base value. You can then take that asset and sell it to someone else, and so you have effectively a money printing machine.
Creating new capital out of basically thin air.
Yeah, and I don't know how much of the economy relies on that capital. I mean, that's a scary thing.
Well, one way to think about it is look how much intensive influence was put on trying to push people into going to college starting in the 1990s. There may never have been a master plan, but all the different elements of the machine align towards fulfilling the needs of the circuit of capital. So stochastically, the system arranges a way to ensure that investment can find sources to realize value from.
Yeah. Which really leads to the question of whether or not Bernie Sanders will be able to pass these policies if he gets elected. I kind of think this is deeply. This is one of those places that I actually do like. I don't know, we're left communists, we don't electoralism, blah blah blah. I do like what the Bernie Sanders campaign is doing. I just worry that they don't have the balls to push it through.
Yeah,
because this is purely a case of class interests. This issue cannot be reconciled without by mediation. It is huge financial capital assets that need to be destroyed, that the proletariat wants to destroy, and I don't know if there's any. I like the reality of these questions is that the reality of this issue is that it's very, very close to saying it plainly. To
people are finally becoming conscious of these issues, and it's being done, through a thoroughly liberal framework. But at the very least, it's beginning. I don't want to get too negative about it, because I think a lot of people are putting more hopes onto Bernie Sanders than he can possibly fulfill. Mm-hmm. But from a revolutionary perspective, it may very well be that his failure serves as sort of an icebreaker to break through this. Yeah.
The more intractable it seems through liberal politics, the more radicalized the proletariat will become. Mm-hmm. I mean, using the American healthcare system is humiliating and insulting, and it makes me want to data redacted.
Yeah, my one of my close family members, he has a union job, and his healthcare insurance will only cover $1,500 in dental work per year.
Yeah,
this is a public sector union job, and anything over that he has to cover on his own. And he has maxed out his allowance just by getting wisdom teeth removed.
Yeah, it's a legitimately horrific system, and I do see
nightmares go in, more nightmares come out.
Yeah, and it's tied to. I mean, thank God. I mean, that's a horrible thing to say, but thank God that the coronavirus started in China and not America, because the Chinese have a health care system that isn't completely degenerate like the American one.
Though that may be coming soon.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine a virus like that happening in I don't know, Louisiana?
Oh, we saw the massive racism that came out towards Chinese people from it. Mm-hmm. If this were to afflict the black community in the United States, we would go straight back to this Jim Crow level racism outpouring.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and it's not impossible. And I say the South or Louisiana because I say Louisiana because it's full of swamps, and I associate swamps with disease. Maybe that's a bit bigoted of me, but I also just in general, it's the part of the country that has the worst living conditions, that has the most oppressive conditions, that has the most sanitary conditions for people. Mm-hmm. On average, there's horrific stuff everywhere. It could happen in Skid Row and Los Angeles.
Corrupt regimes too, and state governments that are working to systematically oppress and disenfranchise the populations as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, there would be no government response. Mm-hmm. What are we kidding?
It would be gated communities, and keep the rich suburbs safe at the expense of everyone else.
So, thank you, Chairman Xi. Anyway, that's a doom and gloom type of episode. So I guess we're back from our break. Anything else?
Speaking of the bureaucratic nightmare, you had a theory about populism that you wanted to share.
Oh yeah. So before we go, I was reading this. Bernie Sanders did an interview about George Wallace. This was in 1973, and it's news today because because of course it is. Yeah, well, because people brought it up to try to make it sound like Bernie Sanders was supporting George Wallace. I just never get over just the level of unmitigated
audacity of these people to take, and I think it's honestly almost 100% sincere on their part. They are so brainwormed that they see a Jew comparing George Wallace to Hitler, and the first thing they can think of is that he must be praising George Wallace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, they've already decided that Bernie Sanders is part of the anti-Semitic Judeo-Bolshevist movement.
Yeah. Haaretz did an op-ed about how Bernie Sanders is, this is their actual title, the last Jewish Bolshevik. This is a supposedly liberal left-leaning Israeli newspaper talking about Judeo-Bolshevism. We're
gonna have to do a thing on Israel.
Yes.
At some point. We're not pro-Israel, in case you hadn't noticed.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I was reading this, and Sanders obviously wasn't in support of Wallace, but his comments were very typically liberal because Bernie Sanders is a liberal, and it struck me, and I started asking questions about where this idea of a demagogue, of a populist demagogue, from the right or the left, they'll say, and I got to thinking about something that I think I read it in either a Zizek paper from the 90s or in Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher, or possibly both. And they're talking about a Franz Kafka short story. So we're a couple layers deep in here. But it's talking about a Franz Kafka story about a guy trying to call a call center and get something done and get through a maze of bureaucracy. But the person is trying to get into contact with someone who can help them with their problem. And the reality is that there's no one who can help them with their problem. They are mired in endless bureaucracy. As the Onion said, if only they'd properly followed proper protocol, none of this would be a problem. But it's impossible. It's not about filling in the right paperwork. It's about there's nowhere to answer. There's no one to answer to. There's no one who can actually do any of the things that need to be done.
Yeah. And
it's an experience that you've probably had if you've ever been through immigration, you've ever had to get a driver's license, or actually it's terrifyingly easy to get a driver's license, or to get medical care.
Yeah, it's these kind of bureaucracies that arise usually when you are in trouble. Say you're trying to file for public assistance in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And you go through multiple different layers of bureaucracy, going from one office to another, trying to find out why you haven't gotten your food stamps filled yet this month.
Mm-hmm.
No one can help you, but they know who you can talk to.
Yeah. And so one of the things is that this is and it struck me there was a strong relationship between this fear of a populist demagogue, the appeal of a populist, and the liberal system, which idealizes this Kafkaesque nightmare, which idealizes this idea of a government of proper rules, of proper contracts, proper social contracts, proper first conditions, and that can then, which then only needs a government that is composed of people who follow norms and follow rules, a government of empty bureaucrats and slime balls.
Yep.
And so this conflict is this fear, this pathological fear of a demagogue, this fear of populism, is actually
what creates demagogues.
Well, it's actually a fear of a trend, of a contradictory trend within liberalism, and what it means is that there's an alienation thing. There's a Hegelian alienation going on where people desire, what they fundamentally desire is concrete labor being controlled consciously by themselves. And this is when you break it down into concrete relationships, this is what you can see. For example, someone needs medical care. They desire to live in a society that A, has medical care, and B, that labor is available to them. Or someone needs food stamps. It's making that the work of society socially available. But if you don't break it down into concrete dimensions, which you should ultimately, you can see that people are have a demand which isn't being met by society, that they want to have met by a government. So you have a mass of the governed, and the mass of the governed, they are the governed, desire a governor, someone to govern them. And this desire, this populism, thus is not revolutionary in nature, but it is reflecting revolutionary desire within the proletariat, such as they are proletariat.
Yeah, it's transgressive, but not yet fully revolutionary.
Mm-hmm. And so this is essentially a demand for someone who will look them in the eye and say, "Yes, I will listen to your problem and I will do something about it,"
Mm-hmm.
because that is impossible to have in a liberal democratic government. And so I think that's my theory of where fascism I think comes from a different place, but that's my theory of populism and demagoguery.
Yeah, people who have been effectively left to the wolves will find an immense appeal in someone who is willing to say,
A shepherd.
"Yeah, here, I'll take care of this."
Mm-hmm. And the reality is that what they need is not a shepherd. What they need is not a good governor.
Mm-hmm. After all, we have to remember shepherds only protect the sheep so that they can exploit them.
Mm-hmm. What they need is license to govern themselves.
Yep. To turn our indirectly social labor into directly social labor.
Mm-hmm. So, I guess we can leave this on and I guess that's a trap for communist movements, especially when they become electoralist,
mm-hmm.
by positioning themselves as a movement that is answerable to the people and yet still seeks power within bourgeois lines. There's an inbuilt problem there. It's on the I'm so close to understanding this. I think it's something like what Pastone was talking about the Holocaust, about how it was the desire for concreteness, not the desire to abolish a certain form of concreteness, to reach through a mist of abstraction and to seize upon a concrete target without understanding that the concreteness is mediated by the capitalist relations just as much as the abstraction. So the desire here is the reasonable desire on the part of the Communist Party to be answerable to the people, to be answerable to represent directly the interests of the people, is very, very close to this idea of being a good governor, being a good government.
To serve the people. Yeah,
exactly. I don't know how to. I feel like that's somehow important. I don't know how to get out of it though. I guess just mass mobilization is the only way.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and that's something that has been grappled with for a very long time in the communist movement.
Yeah.
There's the question Bakunin famously asked of Marx, where what will the 40 million Germans just all participate in government? And Marx just simply said yes.
Mm-hmm. That is the advantage of the Soviet system, the system of tiered Soviets, which is also great for practical reasons because it lets you have a government govern an arbitrary number of people, or not a government governed, but a government of an arbitrary number of people without an absurdly large parliament.
Yep. Delegation and deputation.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I guess the answer is just find a way to. It's bridging that. There's like a gap here between the practical activity of self-defense and defending of labor rights and so on, and making that jump from that to, say, forming governing councils.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if something like that is happening. I think that stuff has happened in like Iran, in that revolutionary wave that was sort of squashed by the whole Soleimani thing.
Yeah, thanks, Trump.
They were forming. As I understand it, there were communes, or not communes, but Soviets of some sort being formed. I wonder if that's happening at all in France yet.
As I understand it, not quite yet. It's still mostly street violence and a few factory occupations.
I noticed that one thing that I read about that was very interesting to me was the nuclear technicians turned off the power to 30,000 people or something.
Mm-hmm.
Which that's very close to seizing control of the means of production.
Yep.
they're very, very close there. Though I don't imagine that there's going to be a communist revolution in France.
Yep. And I am immediately distrustful of people
The
on
French.
the internet who make abstract calls to action. Like you see it all the time on Twitter. Someone with a red and black flag in their
General strike now.
Yep, general strike now.
Mm-hmm.
You can't go straight from crawling to running.
Yeah.
But it is frustrating how, at least right now, it's very hard to get people in the United States mobilized.
Yeah.
To take any real concrete action outside the most timid of protests.
I mean, I think it's a function of like just how oppressive the U.S. is, how effective the police are.
And I think liberals and leftists have managed to corral themselves into this trap where being violent and uproarious is something that the right wing does.
Mm-hmm.
Who are very, very effective about getting riotous crowds from everything from abortion protests to one half step away from an armed putsch against the Virginian government.
It's also worth pointing out is that the right has the implicit support of the government, of the police, and the state when they do this. So it's not like they're intrinsically better at this than the left. In fact, I'd say they're
playing
probably
on easy mode.
Yeah, I'd say they're probably a lot worse at like actual organization than the left. But
they get coddled.
Yeah, but their goals of their organization are explicitly to support the American state. So they're on the same side as the police and so on. So they don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
They're not actually struggling.
Yeah, they're bombarding the headquarters.
Yeah, I mean the what is it? The FBI started the base, the largest neo-Nazi group in America.
Yeah, absolutely amazing.
So yeah, before this drags on too long.
One little tidbit I still it floors me the how brazen it was. Very recently, plastic explosive was found on some buses in a major U.S. city. And it turns out this was left over supposedly from a CIA training exercise about bomb defusal or something. Trying to find where bombs are planted. That's the cover story.
Defusing bombs with... practicing bomb defusal in a major American city with real bombs.
Yeah.
It's so stupid, I almost believe the CIA did it.
Yeah. And it wasn't like these were like their vehicles that were just left out. These were vehicles that belonged to like a preschool. Jesus. And they were never informed about even inert explosive devices being attached onto that, let alone being forgotten there.
Yeah.
So it's like,
Yeah.
Is this Operation Gladio?
I think that, again, I really think that we're in the defensive stage. I think that the goal of communists right now, you can't try to should be stockpiling, preparing, building a base of support, building communities and whatnot in order to be in a winning position, not just for political reasons but for like moral reasons and humanitarian reasons. When the economy crashes and they have to evacuate Pittsburgh because it's been nuclearized, Anyway.
And that is always the question. And I think that should probably be a good way to end the episode. And to anyone out there listening, if you have any ideas for subjects you'd like us to cover or thoughts and comments about the state of the world of the global communist movement, please let us know.
All right.
We have a number of other episodes in the plan, including our long-delayed World War II episode.
Yeah.
We're hoping to have Bill on again to talk about the question of revolutionary defeatism and imperialist war.
Mm-hmm. And we got hopefully some more content lined up for you. We're gonna kind of keep a lid on that until it's more clear what's going to happen. But we hope to be putting out. I don't know. I think we're going to try and put out another episode pretty quick on the heels of this one, and then see what we can do.
All right. Oh.
All right. As always, good luck. Good night. Don't let the
Don't let the deep state bite.
Yeah, don't let the deep state. Or maybe Todd Howard's behind it. It's his secret plan. All right. Thank you. Good night. God bless America.
May God be less.